is a man called Hoshbak Yusufzadeh, and he is a little bit older than me. He's 84 years old. He still runs the oil company out there, and he tells personal tales of the day that he took the oil away from Hitler and took it in a train across the sea, pulled by a barge, to be used in the tanks to fight Nazi Germany. But all this time the oil was being taken out of Azerbaijan and the country was getting poorer and poorer. Then in the 1980s, the Soviet Union began to break up. And in the early 1990s, Moscow allowed Azerbaijan to break away as its own republic. And at that time, Azerbaijan was dirt poor. It had absolutely nothing. I first went there in 2002, so about 10 years ago. And I remember landing in the airport. There were hardly any lights. And we drove into town. And as we drove into town, I thought, we're coming into the centre of the city. And there are still nodding donkeys, even in the middle of the city, and oil spilling out from the nodding donkeys onto the roads in the middle of town. And we took a helicopter to fly out to a remote part of Azerbaijan. And I thought, I've seen this terribly polluted, very sad, very poor city. And now I'd love to see the real mountains, the real scenery of Azerbaijan. And here was the real tragedy. As we took off in the helicopter, all you could see